Margaret's true story. When your own daughter calls you a burden, there is a kind of silence that follows cruelty, not the silence of peace, but the silence of something breaking so quietly that no one hears it. In a quiet suburb of Tucson, Arizona, a 72-year-old woman named Margaret Edwards sat alone in the house she had lived in for 41 years, holding a phone that had just gone silent. Her daughter's words still echoed in the empty kitchen. "Mom, you're becoming a burden to all of us." What Margaret did next would shock her entire family and teach them a lesson about love, sacrifice, and the invisible weight that mothers carry long after their children have grown. But before we get to what happened next, you need to understand who Margaret was, because she was not a woman who broke easily. Margaret had spent 35 years teaching third grade at Catalina Foothills Elementary. 35 years of tying small shoes, of reading stories aloud until her voice went hoarse, of staying late to help children who struggled with letters and numbers. She retired at 67, not because she wanted to, but because her knees had started to give out, and standing for 7 hours a day had become a kind of quiet agony she could no longer hide. Her husband Robert had been the one to convince her it was time. He had held her hand across the kitchen table, the same table where she now sat in the dark, and told her she had given enough, that it was okay to rest. Robert passed from cancer 14 months later. Pancreatic, fast and merciless. 6 years ago now. Margaret buried the man she had loved for 44 years on a Thursday afternoon in September, stood at the graveside until everyone else had left, and then drove herself home. She watered the garden the next morning, because that is what Margaret did. She kept going. The house was full of him, of course. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. His jacket still hung by the back door. Photographs lined every wall and every shelf their wedding day. Karen's first steps, vacation to the Grand Canyon. Christmas mornings layered one on top of another like geological strata of joy. Margaret dusted those frames every week. She talked to Robert's photograph sometimes, usually in the evening, usually about small things. The way the roses were blooming. A cardinal she had seen at the feeder. She was not losing her mind. She was simply lonely, and the photographs listened better than anyone else. Her daughter Karen was 46 now. A successful real estate agent in Phoenix, married to a man named David. Mother to 2 teenagers who Margaret saw perhaps 3 times a year. Karen was busy. Karen was always busy. Phone calls that once lasted an hour had shrunk to 10 minutes, then 5. Visits that once filled a weekend had become rushed. Afternoon stops where Karen glanced at her phone more than she looked at her mother. Margaret made excuses for her because that is what mothers do. She's building her career. The kids have activities. Phoenix is 2 hours away. It's not easy. But something had shifted in the last 3 years, and Margaret felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Karen had grown impatient, distant. There was an edge in her voice that had not been there before, a tone that made Margaret feel like an item on a to-do list rather than a person. 2 weeks before that Tuesday evening in March, Margaret had fallen. It was not dramatic. She had tripped on the edge of the hallway rug, caught her hip on the corner of the dresser, and gone down hard. She could not get up for 20 minutes. When she finally managed to reach the phone, she called Karen. Karen drove down from Phoenix, arrived visibly annoyed, helped Margaret to a doctor's appointment, confirmed nothing was broken, stayed for 4 hours and left. And then came the phone call. Karen's voice was careful at first, the way people sound when they have rehearsed what they are about to say. She called it the situation. She spoke about logistics, about distance, about responsibility. And then she said the words that landed like stones in Margaret's chest. "Mom, I love you. But honestly, you're becoming a burden to all of us. Have you thought about a facility? You can't keep expecting us to drop everything." The line went quiet. Margaret could hear Karen breathing. She could hear the television in the background at Karen's house. Some game show, laughter from a studio audience. She whispered, "I understand, sweetheart," and she hung up. Margaret sat in that dark kitchen for 3 hours without moving. The tea went cold. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. She did not cry. Something else happened instead, something harder and quieter than tears. A clarity settled over her, the kind of clarity that comes to a woman who has already survived the worst grief of her life and knows exactly what she is made of. She would never be called a burden again. Not by anyone, not ever. She stood up slowly, turned on the small light above the stove, found a pen and a yellow legal pad in the junk drawer, and sat back down. She began making a list. What Margaret wrote on that list would set into motion a series of decisions that no one in her family saw coming, least of all Karen. The list Margaret wrote that night was not a list of grievances. It was not a letter to Karen, not a suicide note, not a cry for help. It was a plan. A precise, methodical, deeply considered plan, the kind only a woman who has spent her entire life taking care of details could create. She wrote down everything she owned, everything she owed, and everything she intended to do about it. And then, the very next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops on Marigold Lane, she picked up the phone and called a real estate agent. Not Karen, a woman named Janet Simmons from a brokerage across town, someone who had no connection to Margaret's family and would ask no uncomfortable questions. Janet came by that afternoon. She walked through the house, took measurements, noted the new roof Robert had installed in 2014, the original hardwood floors, the updated kitchen Margaret had paid for herself. She told Margaret the house could list at $310,000. Margaret said, "Listed at $295. I want it sold fast." Janet looked at her for a moment, perhaps sensing something beneath the calm surface, but she nodded and said she would have the paperwork ready by Friday. While the listing was being prepared, Margaret began the harder work. She organized an estate sale quiet. No advertisements in the paper, just a handwritten sign on the corner, and word passed through the neighborhood. Over 2 weekends, strangers walked through her home and placed dollar values on a lifetime. The rocking chair where she had nursed Karen through colic at 3 a.m, where she had sung her the same lullaby, "Too-ra-loo-ra-loo-ral," until her own voice gave out, sold for $40 to a young couple expecting their first child. The dining table, solid oak, where 40 Thanksgivings had been carved and served and argued over and blessed, went for $120 to a man who said he was furnishing a rental property. Robert's tools, his hand planes, his socket wrenches. The table saw he had saved 6 months to buy sold in a single lot to a retired carpenter who at least had the decency to say, "These were well cared for." Margaret nodded and took his cash and did not let herself think about Robert's hands. The books were the hardest. 50 years of collecting. Novels she had underlined, poetry she had memorized, history she had read aloud to Robert during his final months when his eyes could no longer focus on the page. She boxed them up and donated them to the public library. All of them. She told no one in her family, not Karen, not her son David, who lived in Colorado Springs and called once a month, always on a Sunday, always for exactly 12 minutes. Always with the vague promise that he would visit soon. She told her neighbors she was simplifying, downsizing, the word people use when they do not want to explain that their life has been reduced to a decision made in a dark kitchen at midnight. Only one person knew the truth. Gloria Reeves, 74, Margaret's best friend since 1987. The woman who had sat beside her at Robert's funeral and held her hand without saying a single word for 2 straight hours. Gloria came over on the second day of the estate sale, watched a stranger carry out the reading lamp that had always sat beside Robert's chair, and pulled Margaret into the kitchen. She begged her to stop, to call Karen, to reconsider. Margaret looked at her dearest friend and said, "Gloria, I raised that girl, I fed her. I held her through every fever, every heartbreak, every nightmare. I worked 2 jobs to pay for her college, 2 jobs, Gloria, while my back was already failing me. And after all of that, I am a burden. So I will remove the burden." Margaret did not. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young family, 2 children, a golden retriever. Margaret signed the papers in Janet's office, handed over the keys, and did not look at the buyers because she did not want to picture them in her kitchen. She packed 2 suitcases and 1 cardboard box of photographs, everything else. Every dish, every curtain, every piece of the life she had built over 46 years was donated or gone. On her last evening, she walked through the empty house alone. She ran her fingers along the hallway walls. She stood in the doorway of Karen's old bedroom, where the faded outline of a poster still marked the paint, and she pressed her palm flat against the doorframe where Robert had penciled Karen's height every birthday until she was 16. She stood there a long time. Then she turned, walked to the front door, locked it, and dropped the key into the realtor's lockbox. With a sound so small and final it could break your heart, Margaret deposited the money from the sale, along with her savings, $340,000 total, into a single account under her name alone. She did not divide it. She did not set aside a portion for Karen or David. She owed them nothing now. Then she went online and bought a one-way ticket, not to a nursing home, not back to Karen's house. She bought a ticket to Sedona, Arizona, the place she and Robert had visited on their 25th anniversary, where the red rocks had turned gold at sunset, and she had stood on a trail overlooking the valley and told him, "I could live here forever." Robert had smiled and said, "Then someday we will." Someday had finally come. just not the way either of them had imagined. Margaret arrived in Sedona with 2 suitcases and a freedom she hadn't felt in decades, but back in Phoenix, the silence she left behind was about to get very loud. The casita she found was small, 1-bedroom, a kitchenette with a window that faced east and a porch barely wide enough for a single chair. It sat on a quiet road just outside town, tucked against a slope of juniper and rust-colored earth, with a view of the red rock formations that rose like ancient cathedrals against the sky. The rent was modest, the silence was enormous. And on her first morning there, Margaret woke before dawn, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and stepped outside to watch the sunrise, set the cliffs on fire amber, then copper, then a deep and glowing rust that seemed to pulse with life. She stood there for a long time, breathing, not waiting for anything, not adjusting herself to anyone's schedule, not listening for a phone that would never ring with warmth. For the first time in more years than she could count, Margaret existed only for herself. And she felt it a strange, almost guilty pleasure, like eating dessert before dinner. The freedom of having no one to answer to, no one to disappoint, no one to be a burden to. It took a few weeks before she found her footing. She wandered Sedona's streets, visited the shops, sat in cafes where tourists passed through without noticing the quiet woman in the corner reading a paperback. Then one afternoon, she saw a flyer at the public library. The community center was looking for volunteers to teach reading to adults who had never finished school. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she signed up. She had spent 31 years in a classroom. She had believed that chapter of her life was closed. But the moment she sat down across from a 53-year-old man named Hector, who could not read the label on his own medication, something inside her woke up. Her teaching instincts returned like muscle memory. She leaned forward. She listened. She guided his finger across the page with patience she had forgotten she possessed. And Hector looked up at her after reading his first full sentence and said, "Thank you, ma'am," with tears in his eyes. Margaret drove home that evening and cried in her car, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being useful again, of being seen not as a problem to manage, but as someone with something to give. It was through the community center that she met the women who would change everything, a group of retirees, artists, and wanderers who gathered every Wednesday morning for coffee and a hike among the trails. There was Dolores, a former nurse from Chicago. June, a widow like Margaret, who had lost her husband to cancer and moved west to start over. Patricia, who painted landscapes and swore like a sailor, and made Margaret laugh so hard she once had to sit down on a rock and catch her breath. They called themselves the Red Rock Women, and they adopted Margaret without hesitation. For the first time since Robert died, Margaret laughed from her belly, deep, full, unguarded laughter that echoed off the canyon walls and startled the birds. She started a garden at the casita, tomatoes, herbs, desert wildflowers that bloomed in defiant color against the dry soil. She began painting watercolors, something she had always wanted to try, but never had time for while raising children, running a classroom, and then spending those final years caring for Robert through his illness. She painted the red rocks at different hours, the way the light changed them from morning to evening. She painted the sunsets, the yucca blossoms, the wide and indifferent sky. A gallery owner named Martin saw 3 of her pieces displayed at the community center and asked if he could hang them in his shop downtown. Within a week, 2 of them sold. Margaret stared at the small check in her hands and thought, 72 years old, and I am just now discovering who I might have been all along. She also began writing. Not a memoir. She had no interest in organizing her pain into chapters. She wrote letters. Letters she never sent. Letters to Robert about how the sky from her kitchen window looked like something he would have painted if he had known how. Letters to her younger self about what she wished she had understood about motherhood, that loving your children does not guarantee they will love you back in the same language. And one letter to Karen. She wrote it slowly, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of her nightstand. It said simply, "I loved you enough to leave so you would never have to feel guilty about me again. But I want you to know I was never the burden. The burden was your indifference." She closed the drawer and did not open it again. While Margaret was building a life she never imagined possible, painting, teaching, laughing among women who chose her company freely, Karen was about to discover that her mother had vanished. And when that realization finally came, the guilt would hit like an avalanche. 6 weeks passed before Karen made the drive from Phoenix to Tucson. She had been meaning to call, meaning to check in, but there was always something: a work deadline, a school event for the kids, a dinner party she could not miss. The visit was not born from longing. It was born from obligation, the kind that sits in the back of your mind like an unpaid bill, nagging just enough to make you act before the guilt becomes unbearable. She pulled into the neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon, windows down, radio playing softly. She turned onto her mother's street and slowed the car. Something was wrong. There was a sign in the yard, bold red letters on white. Sold. The curtains Margaret had hung 15 years ago were gone. The porch where her father's rocking chair once sat was bare. A young couple stood near the front door, holding boxes, laughing about where to put the couch. Karen parked across the street and sat there. For a long moment, her hand still on the steering wheel. She got out slowly, walked across the lawn, and asked the couple when they had moved in. 3 weeks ago, they told her. They had bought the house from an older woman who sold it furnished, below market price, and moved away without leaving a forwarding address. Karen's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. She dialed Margaret's number. It rang 4 times, 5-6. On the other end, in a small apartment 2 hours away, Margaret looked down at the screen, saw her daughter's name, and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. For the first time in 72 years, she chose not to answer. Karen called again and again. Then she called her brother David in Colorado. David picked up on the third ring, his voice distant and distracted. He said he hadn't spoken to their mother in over 2 months. He admitted he hadn't thought much about it. Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her, something cracking in the structure she had always assumed was permanent. She called Gloria next. Gloria. Margaret's closest friend, the woman who had been there for every birthday Karen had forgotten. Gloria answered, and her voice was ice. Your mother is safe, she is well, and she does not want to be found right now. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. Maybe you should think about why. The line went dead. Karen sat in the driver's seat of her car outside that empty house, and for the first time in years, she did not have a response. She was furious at first. How dare her mother disappear without telling her? How dare Gloria speak to her that way? Then the fury gave way to something colder, something that crept in through the cracks. Terror. The realization that her mother, the one person who had always been there, had chosen to leave. And then slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape she had refused to look at, came shame. The memories arrived uninvited. Margaret driving 2 hours to watch Karen's son play soccer, only to find that Karen had not saved her a seat, had barely acknowledged she was there. Margaret calling on her birthday, and Karen letting it go to voicemail because she was at brunch with friends. Margaret asking quietly, hopefully, if she might spend Christmas at Karen's house, and Karen saying, "It's just so hectic, Mom, maybe next year," and the phone call. That terrible phone call. The word that had shattered everything. Burden. Karen had said it casually, the way you might describe traffic or bad weather, something inconvenient, something you endure. She had not even paused after saying it. She had not heard the silence on the other end. The silence of a heart breaking cleanly in two. Karen pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and wept. Not the polished, controlled tears she sometimes allowed herself at sad movies. These were ugly, shaking sobs, the kind that come from a place so deep you did not even know it existed until it split open. That evening, Tom found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. He sat down across from her. He was gentle the way he always was, but he did not lie. "Karen, your mother didn't disappear," he said quietly. "She removed herself, because you made her feel like she had no place in your life. That's different." Karen opened her mouth to argue, to defend, to explain. But the words would not come, because Tom was right, and somewhere inside she had always known. In the days that followed, Karen searched. She called hospitals, senior centers, churches in Tucson and the surrounding towns. She contacted mutual friends, distant relatives, anyone who might know where Margaret had gone. Nothing. Her mother had rebuilt her life entirely outside Karen's awareness, and the silence was deafening. For the first time, Karen understood what it felt like to reach for someone and find only empty space, the exact feeling Margaret had carried for years. It would take Karen 4 more months to find her mother, and what she found when she did would change the way she understood love forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Karen found her. She had been searching online for something else entirely, a gift idea, a watercolor print for a colleague's birthday, when a small gallery website in Sedona loaded on her screen. The paintings were landscapes, red rock canyons bathed in golden light, desert wildflowers pressing through cracked earth. They were beautiful, and beneath the third painting in the collection, in a simple italic font, was the name Margaret Ellison. Karen stared at the screen for a full minute without breathing. Then she closed her laptop, picked up her car keys, and drove north without calling ahead. The drive from Phoenix to Sedona takes about 2 hours. Karen made it in silence. No radio, no phone calls. Just the highway unwinding before her and the red formations slowly rising on the horizon like ancient cathedrals. She did not rehearse what she would say. She did not plan an apology or a speech. She simply drove, because for the first time in months, she knew exactly where her mother was, and the not knowing had been unbearable. She found the casita at the end of a dirt road, tucked against a hillside with a small garden out front, herbs and marigolds, and a wooden bench painted turquoise. Karen parked, walked to the door, and knocked. The sound of her own knuckles against the wood felt enormous. Footsteps. The door opened, and there was Margaret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Karen had expected to find her mother diminished, fragile, perhaps confused. Instead, the woman standing before her was tanned and thinner. Yes, but somehow younger. Her silver hair was pulled back loosely. Her eyes were clear and steady. She wore a linen shirt smudged faintly with paint. She was not the frail, fading woman Karen had imagined during all those sleepless nights. She was vibrant. She was alive, and she did not look surprised. "Mom," Karen finally said, her voice cracking. "I've been looking for you." Margaret held the door open a little wider. "I know," she said gently. "I wasn't hiding. I was just finally living." They sat across from each other at a small kitchen table. The conversation that followed was not a Hollywood reunion. There was no rushing into each other's arms, no swelling music, no instant forgiveness wrapped in a neat bow. It was painful, it was halting, and it was honest. Karen broke down first. She apologized for the word burden. She said it had haunted her every day since Margaret disappeared. She said she had not meant it. Margaret listened without interrupting. She let Karen finish. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm but unwavering. "Karen, I forgive you for the word." But the word was just the end of something that had been happening for years. You stopped seeing me as a person. I became a task on your list, a problem to manage. And when I became inconvenient, you wanted to file me away somewhere. The word didn't break us. It just finally said out loud what your actions had been whispering for a long time. Karen could not argue. She sat with the truth of it pressing against her chest like a stone. Later, Margaret led her outside. She showed Karen the garden she had built with her own hands, the small studio where she painted every morning before the heat settled in. She introduced her to two of the Red Rock women who happened to stop by: Dolores with her booming laugh and Ruth with her quiet warmth. Karen watched her mother pour iced tea and trade jokes, and stand in the easy company of people who genuinely enjoyed her presence. She saw Margaret admired, valued, sought out, not tolerated, not managed, wanted. And in that moment, Karen understood something she had refused to see before. Margaret had not left out of spite. She had not disappeared to punish anyone. She had left because she deserved more than what her own children had been willing to give her. She had chosen dignity over dependence, self-respect over slow erasure, and that choice had taken more courage than Karen had ever shown in her entire life. Before Karen left that evening, Margaret made one thing clear. She would not move back to Tucson. She would not move to Phoenix. She would stay in Sedona, in her casita, among her paintings and her garden and her friends. "You are welcome in my life, Karen," she said, standing in the doorway as the last light turned the cliffs to copper. "But you will never again be the center of it. I spent 46 years revolving around you and your brother. Now I revolve around myself, and I am not sorry for that." Karen nodded. She did not argue. She stayed for dinner. They ate together on the small patio overlooking the Red Rocks, grilled vegetables, warm bread, a glass of wine. The conversation was careful, measured, full of pauses. It was not comfortable, it was not resolved, but it was real. And for the first time in a very long time, they were not mother and burden, not parent and obligation. They were two women sitting together at a table, eating a quiet meal, beginning something fragile and honest that neither of them could yet name. Margaret's story did not end with that dinner. It continued to unfold in ways that carried lessons for every family willing to listen. Because Margaret's story is not just Margaret's story. It is the story of every mother who ever held her breath so her children could breathe easier. It is the story of every father who worked overtime in silence so his daughter could have a prom dress she would wear once and forget about. It is the story of every aging parent who sits alone at a kitchen table, phone within reach, waiting for a call that comes less and less often until one day it stops coming altogether. And what Margaret's journey teaches us, if we are brave enough to hear, it is a truth so simple it almost feels insulting to say out loud. Aging parents are not burdens. They are the foundations upon which entire families were built. They are the hands that shaped everything. And the fact that those hands now tremble does not make them less valuable. It makes them sacred. But we forget this. We forget it so easily, so naturally, that we do not even notice the forgetting. And that is perhaps the cruelest part. The adult children who make their parents feel invisible rarely do it with malice. They do it with busyness. They do it with distraction. They treat phone calls as obligations to check off a list. They cancel visits and promise to reschedule and never do. They make decisions about their parents' living situations, their finances, their daily routines without ever once asking what their parents actually want. They confuse care with control. They assume that because a mother has always been there, she will always be there. They assume that her love is not only unconditional but inexhaustible. And here is the truth that Margaret's story lays bare. Yes, a mother's love is unconditional. But the woman carrying that love is not inexhaustible. She is flesh and bone and a heart that can only absorb so much indifference before something inside it quietly closes. Even the most devoted mother has a breaking point. Margaret found hers at 72. But what makes her story remarkable is not the breaking. It is what she did after. She chose herself without choosing cruelty. She did not scream at Karen. She did not write bitter letters or make guilt-soaked phone calls. She did not weaponize her pain. She simply, quietly, with enormous dignity, decided that she deserved to spend her remaining years feeling valued. And then she built that life with her own 2 hands. She packed boxes. She drove across state lines. She planted flowers in unfamiliar soil. She made friends with strangers who became family. Margaret's story is not about revenge. It is not about punishment. It is about reclamation. It is about a woman who remembered at an age when the world tells you it is too late to remember anything new that she was still a whole person. A person with dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. A person with desires and curiosity and the fundamental, non-negotiable right to be treated with respect. And so I want to speak directly to you now. If you have an aging parent, call them today. Not tomorrow, not this weekend, today. And when they answer, do not ask about their medications. Do not ask whether they remembered their doctor's appointment. Ask them what made them smile this week. Ask them what they have been thinking about. Ask them what they dream about, because they still dream, even if no one has bothered to ask in years. Ask them what they need and then actually provide it, not with resentment, not with sighing. With the same wholehearted willingness they once showed you when you needed everything and could give nothing in return. Because one day you will reach for them and they will not be there. And the silence they leave behind will be louder than anything you have ever heard in your life. It will fill rooms. It will sit in empty chairs at holiday tables. It will echo in the phone that rings and rings with no answer on the other end. Margaret shared something with Gloria one Wednesday morning as they hiked through the red rocks outside Sedona, the early light painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. She stopped on the trail, looked out over the valley, and said, "I thought leaving would be the hardest thing I ever did. But it was not. The hardest thing was realizing I had to. The hardest thing was understanding that the people I loved most in this world had forgotten how to love me back." She paused, and then she smiled, not with sadness, but with something that looked like freedom. And the most beautiful thing was discovering that I had not forgotten how to love myself. Margaret found peace on her own terms. She found purpose in a small desert town that asked nothing of her except that she show up as herself. And Karen slowly, painfully, over the course of months and quiet visits, came to a reckoning that changed her. Not all at once, not dramatically, but deeply. She began to understand what family truly means, not as a word you say at holidays, but as a practice you live every single day. Margaret's story reminds us of something we should never need reminding of, and yet always do. The people we take for granted are almost always the ones holding everything together. And by the time we notice, they may have already let go.